weather is definitely better than the Netherlands right now. We have like 25 degrees, and probably in Portugal it's more. And always in the Netherlands, when the weather is like this, it's really hot and warm, and you're definitely gonna want some rain. But for my home, it's fine. So I can talk to you about how you can use TypeScript together with GraphQL to create web applications. So let me start by sharing my screen instead of my face, so you can see my presentation. How is that? Is everyone seeing my slides?
Yes, it's
Yes,
fine.
so web application of the future, and for this we're going to use TypeScript and GraphQL together. And so who's this for? This talk's actually for people that already have some familiarity with TypeScript or with GraphQL and make applications with preferably React, but you can also use Angular or just vanilla JavaScript or actually TypeScript in this case. So let me start with my story by asking you what a date is. So a date can be a lot of things, right? Probably one form of dates you haven't had that many recently with all the lockdowns going on. Um, but one form of date is actually the today's date or a different date in the past. So an actual day or a date is what we call a date. But a date is also some sort of kind of ripe fruit. So I'm not really a fan of ripe fruit, but maybe some of you are. But they actually can also be a date. And then you can also even make the word date. So the word date itself is also date. So we have three kinds of dates that there are already, and you can think about how this would work in programming, right? All those different dates. What actually is a date? Is it maybe a string? Is it an integer? Maybe it's an actual date timestamp, or maybe it's a timestamp. It can be basically everything. And like especially these kinds of dates, if you don't have like a relationship, you probably didn't have a date like this quite often the last few months. So let's look at JavaScript. So in JavaScript, date can be everything, right? It can be a variable, it can be a constant, it can be a let variable. It can also be a date object, or it can just be a string representing a date object, or maybe it's a timestamp. Um, Maybe it's a string with some formatted kind of date. So maybe I'm not really sure what the date format in Portugal is, but I guess it's pretty much the same as in the Netherlands, just with different local strings. But all these things can be considered a date. And it can get quite confusing, and probably it will lead to bugs in your application at some point. So that's why you actually need type systems. So in this talk, I won't only show you how you can have TypeScript and GraphQL work together, but I'm also going to show you why you actually need type systems. Because type systems, they're going to make your life a whole lot easier. Actually, I believe one of the previous talks, or maybe the talk after this, is going to be about um, how a company actually incorporated TypeScript in the project instead of JavaScript, and how it saved them like a tons of bugs and made the developer experience way better. So that's about type systems. Let me tell you a bit about myself. So, like I told you, my name is Roy. I'm calling in from Amsterdam, which is almost the same time as here. It's an hour later. So, I'm already looking forward to have lunch after this one. So, most of my time I spent working on open source projects for the city of Amsterdam, where we create all sorts of JavaScript, TypeScript, React, but also Python projects to create applications and APIs to make the life of people working in Amsterdam better, but also for people living in Amsterdam, and also for researchers and people that work for the university. And I also teach React and GraphQL at the React GraphQL Academy, and I also work with some other companies to help them create cool content or work on their open source projects. So, what do you already know about TypeScript? Usually, when we would have been in some sort of hall, I saw fingers. So, I'm going to assume like 50% of you already know something about TypeScript, and maybe the other half has heard about it but doesn't really know how it works. So, what TypeScript actually is, TypeScript is a type superset of JavaScript. So, that might seem like gibberish to you. What actually is a type superset? So, if we ask the internet, the type superset or a superset in general actually is a programming language that contains all the features of a given language. So, this tells us that TypeScript has all the features that JavaScript has, but those features have been expanded or enhanced to include other features as well. And this is where the type comes in. So TypeScript is a typed superset of JavaScript. So basically, it means it has all the features that JavaScript has, but it has a type system, something that JavaScript does not have. So maybe when you're working with React, you may be using prop types, or you might be using Flow to introduce some sort of type system into your code. With TypeScript, you already have an integrated type system. So that could be one reason to change from JavaScript to TypeScript to get the type system that's already included. And as it's a type superset, the outcome or the compilation, the compiled files you get from TypeScript can be in JavaScript. So you can actually define how you want TypeScript to output your JavaScript code. So maybe you want it to be returned in ES5, so your browser will understand it. Maybe you only use modern browsers or React Native and you want it to output ES6 or maybe native code. So you can use TypeScript to compile to plain JavaScript. And it's up to you how to configure it and how to actually tell TypeScript's compilers to output the JavaScript code. So if we look on the left, you can actually see TypeScript code. So you can see we have a type called fruit. It has two fields or two types. There's our names and variety. They're both strings. And we have a function called create array. And in this function, we're going to use this type for the input, and actually we should have used a type for the output as well, but clearly I forgot, or maybe I don't want my type to be my code to be fully typed. And on the left you can actually see the output. So in here I chose to return ES5, but also I can write my TypeScript code in ES6 or ESNext, or use all the new cool JavaScript features and then output just ES5, like maybe I would otherwise do with Webpack or Snowpack or whatever kind of pack you're using to compile your code. And this will actually make sure that's readable to the browser. So you'll always be sure that you can use the latest JavaScript code in TypeScript and output it to your browser just as plain JavaScript in a way the browser would actually understand. So a lot of the applications you actually create, they're being used in Internet Explorer. So even Internet Explorer can understand the code that I compiled from TypeScript. So I think that's pretty cool. And like I just told you, it uses the latest ECMAScript feature. So a few months ago, we had the release of TypeScript, of a new release of TypeScript that actually integrated all the ESNext features, like optional chaining or knowledge coalescing, searching functions. So all these things that are new to JavaScript, they're all being introduced in TypeScript because we're using a typed superset. So the main idea of the type superset should always be it's in sync with actual language. It's a superset of. So it would be strange if you with your JavaScript going one way and the TypeScript going the other way. It will always follow the same directions. As for now, it's the ECMAScript description. So you always be certain that if something is new in the latest ECMAScript release, it will always be there in TypeScript as well. And then you might know what also is type. So if you are familiar with GraphQL, you probably figured already that those two type systems could work very well together. So as GraphQL also has types, you can be pretty sure that those type systems have a way to interact with each other, or maybe even have a way to be synced with each other, or maybe the one could be generated from the other feature. So both have type systems, and that's why they can work together very well. And if you're already thinking, what the hell is GraphQL? Let me tell you what GraphQL is, because maybe you don't know what GraphQL is. It isn't strange because GraphQL it's not around for that long. It's like only 5 years in stable release. But yeah, let's have a look at it. So GraphQL is what we call a query language for APIs. And another form of a query language for APIs is the REST specification. So REST is a specification on how you can actually interact with APIs. In the same way, GraphQL is a convention to interact with APIs. So it's what we call a query language. Basically looks like this. So on the left, you can see a query. So this is what a GraphQL query looks like. It's a bit different from how queries you might use from like SQL and NoSQL databases look like, but it's what it looks like. So we're going to define, we have a query. We're going to ask for something, which is a product. We've defined an argument, so the argument ID with the value of 3. And we're going to ask for some fields to be returned. And then on the right side, you can see that all the fields that we're asking for those fields will be returned to us. So you can see we have an object called data. It will return a field called product, which is an object, and it's all the fields we requested, like a title, a thumbnail, or price. And something you don't see in here, but I'm going to show you later on, is that those fields all have types. So we'll always be certain that when we ask for a title, it will always be a string. And if you look at price, I guess it's a float. So price will always be a float. It won't ever become an integer or a string because that isn't possible. Then GraphQL will break because it has a type system. And something else that's differently from query languages for APIs you might know, like REST, is it offers a single endpoint for multiple resources. So whatever happens, you will always know you can get all your data from just one endpoint, and you aren't tied to certain endpoints like you would be used to with REST. So if we look at this query, it's almost the same query that we just saw. So we still have to find that we want a query. We have to find we're looking for a product with the ID of number 3. And we're going to ask for the title and the thumbnail. And I added some fields like price. I also added relational fields. So if you look at the categories field, it's a relational field. So categories has a relationship with product. And in that relationship, we're going to ask some information about the categories like the title. And we're doing the same for the reviews. So the reviews is also a relationship with product. And then we're going to ask for the average rating for this product with the ID of 3. So if you would be working with a REST API, you're probably going to have to send 3 different requests, right? Because one is for the general product information, another is for the information about the product categories, another one is about information for the product reviews. And with GraphQL, we're going to define all those nested relationships just in one single query. And if you look at your output on the right, you can see it returns category information for us in the form of a title, which is always a string. And if you look at this, you might not see the difference between reviews and categories just yet, because somehow categories returns an array and reviews returns an object. Well, in my query, they both look the same. So that is something that's defined in the type system. So the type system of GraphQL actually tells you whether or not something is an array of certain types or something is just a return of a certain type. So the return type of categories will be an array of the category type, while the return of reviews actually will be just a return type with review. So this is something I'll show you on the schema later on. And like I told you, they're both based on the type system. So whenever you're going to insert or request, or you're going to do something with a variable that comes out or goes into GraphQL, it's going to return you errors if it has the incorrect type. So if we would look at this mutation, you can see it's called add offer. So we're going to maybe place a bid on some product because we were working with products just yet. And you can see we also have an input field, and we're going to input certain variables. So on your bottom left, you can see the query variables that I'm sending in. So these are the values of the offer I'm trying to add. And you can see I'm sending in some values like the product ID, which is a string with the content of 3. Doing the same for reseller with another string. And then price is an integer. And on the right side, you can see we're actually getting an error as response. So on the previous query, we just got nicely formatted JSON. And now we're getting a nicely formatted error message in JSON. So what we actually see, we can see variable input, got invalid value, blah, 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 for product ID, which is a 3. So actually it expected our product ID to be an integer, and it doesn't expect it to be a string. So this is where GraphQL already helps you by making sure that all the values will be in the correct format, and otherwise it would just throw errors. So you can't mutate data or request data if you're putting in data in the wrong format. So this is where the type system comes in. And something that's good to know, those type systems, they aren't too different. So there are similarities between the type system of TypeScript and similarities with the type system of GraphQL. And let's look at those similarities. So on the left side, you can see how you define a type for TypeScript. And if you already know TypeScript, you might be wondering why it isn't a type and not an interface. Yeah, that's something like more of a personal matter, and I'm not thinking about enhancing this product type. So just leave it like that. If you're new to TypeScript and you think, what's the difference between types and interfaces? There aren't that many differences. So if you're really interested, go look at the documentation. And if you're indifferent like me, just use whatever you like best. So on the right, so you can see how you define a type for GraphQL. And as you can see, we've defined the same fields, only the definition of what the type of that field is different. So let's look at some of those differences and similarities. Because if you look at the ID and title, you can see we're using number and string. And for product, we're using integer and string for GraphQL. So you can already see there are some similarities. And you can also see both have um, basics like what we call in GraphQL scalar types. So those are like the ground types. I believe there are 5 or 6. And you always be sure that those types can be used in any schema. And you always know that if you use those types, your code probably won't break because the schema automatically recognizes these. And they can also have relationships with other types. And if you look at the TypeScript part, you can see we have categories, which is an array of the type category. And on the right side for GraphQL, you can see the same thing. So categories is an array type of category. And it's basically pretty much as the same setup. And if you're wondering about the exclamation mark, I'm going to show you right now. Those is the required optional, is the required or optional flag. So for TypeScript, which is a different way of thinking, is TypeScript usually thinks all your types are required unless you specify them not to be required. So in TypeScript, you're going to define with a question mark whether or not something is optional, and otherwise everything is required. So you're going to get errors if you're going to do something with the type of product and you're not going to define something for title. And in GraphQL, we're doing almost the same thing, but the other way around. We're going to believe everything is optional because the setup of GraphQL is you're going to ask for data, you're only going to ask for data that you need. Well, TypeScript types still bring you safety um, by assuming everything is required unless you specify it to be optional. So those are some similarities, but also some differences. And as you're probably already thinking about this, how can we combine those two type systems? So those two type systems can be combined pretty well. And there are different ways to doing so. So in this talk, I'm mostly going to show you how you can do this from a front-end side of perspective. But if you're working on a backend, then you can use TypeScript and GraphQL very well together as well. So the demo I'm going to show you later on with something called the Graphical Code Generator is something that can be used on both the backend and the front end. But if you're starting with maybe a greenfield project, then there is something called Type GraphQL, which is a way to create TypeScript GraphQL servers, and it works a bit different. So I'm going to tell you more about this later on, but if you're already getting curious about how to use TypeScript and GraphQL on the backend side, go look up Type GraphQL, and maybe we can talk about it in the questions later on. So for now, let's focus on the front side perspective. Like I told you, by using GraphQL Code Generator, which is built by the Guild, which is open source, which creates open source code, and some of them are actually living right here in Amsterdam, and the others are just working remotely all over the globe. So the company pretty much fits the current situation for most people, I guess. So let me talk about what GraphQL Code Generator actually is. So GraphQL Code Generator is what we call a CLI tool. So you can use it just from your terminal. And you can also use it like on demand from with any kind of script you're using. And it's a CLI tool that generates TypeScript types from a GraphQL schema. So what it actually does, it takes your schema from GraphQL as a sort of truth. So whatever you're doing, GraphQL schema will always be your one source of truth. And from the schema, it will generate TypeScript types that you can use in your project. And I already talked a bit about Type GraphQL, but Type GraphQL is the other way around. So you're actually going to use TypeScript types to define your GraphQL schema. So maybe it's better for greenfield projects, but for now, let's look at the front-end side perspective. So do you still remember the above type definitions? So let's have a quick look again. So we have a type for product, which is all those fields. We have types defined for those fields, and we also have relationships. And for GraphQL, we have the exact same thing, right? So you can probably already think that if we look at the field ID, it's a number in product in TypeScript and it's an integer in GraphQL. There's some way to map it, right? You're just going to say every number is an integer in GraphQL. It doesn't have the question mark, so it's required. So let's put an exclamation mark behind it in GraphQL. And the same is probably for title, right? So you have a title, it feels a string. In GraphQL, it's a string as well. It's written a little bit differently, but still the way to convert those, right? And the only thing that's actually is getting harder is where you go to categories and reviews because they have relationships with other types. So it's going to take some level of nesting if you would create a formatter for this yourself. So maybe you could be thinking about creating a cool generator from GraphQL types from TypeScript or the other way around. This is something that GraphQL code generator already does for you. And like I told you, the graphical schema, it's a source of truth. So whatever is defined in a graphical schema, it will be outputted in TypeScript. So you can't mutate the graphical schema with TypeScript in this setup. That's something that should be important to understand. And I've just switched those around. So if we look at the GraphQL schema, the type product will be converted to TypeScript, and then it will look like this. So you would still have all the TypeScript functionalities, but you haven't created the types yourself. And basically, like I told you about the basic color types, if you try to convert it yourself, you can actually see there are some basic TypeScript types that can be mapped to GraphQL types. So um, the ID type in GraphQL is something I haven't talked about because I used in this example, but it's actually usually a string. So it's a way of GraphQL types to be defined something should be unique. And you can see the relationships with string and string, boolean, boolean, integer number, float number. They're pretty much the same. And if you work with TypeScript, you can probably create some sort of mapping with it. And you can also keep the relationships with non-scalar types because the stuff you see on the top left, those are the scalar types, and those will never change. They will always be there in GraphQL. And if you look on the left, you can see there are relationships with other types. So those relationships are harder to actually auto-generate. So that's why a package like GraphQL Code Generator can actually help you doing so. So how does it work? Like I told you, the GraphQL Code Generator is a CLI, something you can just install using npm or yarn, and you only have to use it as a developer dependency because you don't. The way it actually works, you would generate your types, and your types are pushed and only used in the build, and they aren't used after. So you can just use a developer dependency, and then you can use the wizard to set up the GraphQL Code Generator configuration. So there are some questions that will be asked, like how do you want your codes to look like? What's your sort of truth? Where did you place your GraphQL documents? And something I'm going to tell you about documents later. Or you can define your own settings. So if you've got a bit more complex project, you don't want to follow the default specifications, they can just define your own settings. And this is done with a YAML file. And in this YAML file, you're going to say where GraphQL Code Generator can find your GraphQL schema. So this can be locally, maybe you have a locally created schema, or this can be external. So you can even use Code Generator to create TypeScript types from maybe the GitHub GraphQL API. So those are all things you can do. And then you can just run the CLI and it's going to generate all the types for you. And this might sound like magic, so that's why I created some examples for you. Oh, let's go to the other way. Yes, so the first thing I actually did was creating a GraphQL API. So I've created this GraphQL API. It runs on Code Sandbox. Let me just refresh this to be sure. So now Code Sandbox is running my GraphQL server. It's going to return me some data. And as it's GraphQL, I have full ownership of all the data that's returned. So I have a query, it's called get products. It's going to get product information. It's going to return an ID, like it does here. It's going to return the title. And it has a relationship with something called offers. And there's that fields in it as well. And as it's GraphQL, I can just define what it would look like, right? So I can do this because maybe on one page I'm only using the ID and title. I'm going to run the code. And then what's returned is way less. and how this actually works. I've created other talks about this previously, even at JNation last year. So if you're really getting started with GraphQL and want to know more about this, make sure to find the talk online because I believe they were just posted recently. Um, but to be short, all this is based on the GraphQL schema. So the queries I can define right here, they're based on the schema you can see here. So in this particular situation, I'm asking for products information, which will be this query. And you can see the type. I believe we saw this type before. Um, it has an ID, it has a title, thumbnail, relationships with other fields, and it also has deprecated fields, which can be a thing in GraphQL as well. And you can just click through and you can see what an integer actually is. It's a non-fractional signed whole numeric values, which is a whole lot of words for just an integer. I just call them integers, but and you can also look on a relationship. So with a relationship with reviews, you can just click on it and it's going to find the type review for you. So this is all automatically done by GraphQL itself. So you can just include the GraphQL playground or maybe use GraphQL, which is another thing which is very similar to this GraphQL playground. And it's going to help you and it's also going to auto-generate all this documentation for your server. So if you're working with GraphQL, you just get past a new GraphQL server, make sure to find out if there's a playground. And if there's a playground, just go play with it and go see what you can actually do. So from here, we can see we can add other fields for this one, like a thumbnail, and it's going to autocomplete your request. So and you can also see some very nice thumbnails for my blue t-shirt. So this is most of the things I want to talk to you about GraphQL. And let's have a look at some TypeScript code here. So I've created a small application and I believe it's running somewhere. Let's see where we can find it. Let's hope it's not on the same port. Let's go here. Yes. So this is my application. It's very fancy, right? I'm basically doing this request. I'm asking for products information. What else am I using here? I'm probably using the title. I'm not using the thumbnail. So those are my titles, right? That I use in this application. And then I'm using something called offer information. So if you want to know more about this, maybe we can start asking about offers. Maybe have a click right here. It's tracing it for me. No, it takes so long. Just proceed. We're going to go with offers. It's a relationship. So let's open a relationship. Maybe we're using more information from offer. So we can just go here, look at the queries, products, offer. You can see it's an array. And then we can see the fields in there. So let me see what I'm using here. I'm probably using like the reseller name and the price. So we go for reseller and price. It's all in there. And the price. Yes. So basically this query that I'm sending right here, it's going to get me products information. We can see titles. We can see offers that are being added for this one. And we can see this for like the blue t-shirt, the bright red purse, and for a nice backpack. And this is what's happening in this application. So that's all there is to it. I didn't put that much time in there because actually the thing I want to show you is not a nice application, but it's how you can reuse those types from your GraphQL schema inside an actual application without having to go over the typings all over. So if you're familiar with TypeScript, you can see I've created types here. And here, this is something we might already saw. And here I chose for interfaces, but I can also just for types. But not in this scenario, I guess. Just need to change them a bit. Let me just make types out of it to be more consistent with the slides I just showed you. Let's make this a type as well. Yes. So we have some TypeScript types here, right? So one is for called getting products. And this is actually, it's being used by my GraphQL Apollo query component. So in this application, I'm using React Apollo, a slightly older version. Sorry for that, because Apollo is using hooks out of the box now, I believe, in their latest beta version, or maybe it's already being pushed to stable. But I chose for the query component because I think more people are actually very familiar with the query component instead of using hooks, especially if you're not familiar with React that much. So in here, I've created an application and I've created types for it as well. So I have a query component, which is used to send this query to get my products, offers, reseller, which is this query. So just to be sure, purify it. Yes. So we're working with the exactly same query in here. So this query component is getting this query, which is all the information that we're showing in our application right here. So this query component, it's going to be returning data, like you see over here, and we want the data to have certain types, right? So you can already see the query components. It's using generics to get my products type, which is this one, and it will know, like, it will return the information in this format. So my data object, it will have products in there that have the type product, which is an array because we're defining multiple products, and product will look like this. It has another relationship with offer. So it's already getting quite complex. And this return fields where the data and the product is based on the JSON return from the GraphQL server, which you can see here. So data and products. And it loops over this data. And then you can see I have data, I have products. I want to map over it because I'm using TypeScript. And TypeScript is based on JavaScript. So we have a map function. And you can see this map function, if we already destructure it, it will have the field type, it will have the type of product. And if we would release this one, then TypeScript no longer knows what would be the actual fields of what will be the type of those fields. Because this query component isn't strongly types. It's just taking some types for just this first return of data object, but it doesn't actually know if products will certainly have this type. So that's why we need to add those typings again. And then we'll be for sure. So this won't return any runtimes errors based on our GraphQL code, as long as our GraphQL returns stay the same. So again, this will also be the same. But now it's something else can happen, right? Because I'm adding all those types myself. So every time I change something on my server or my response, I'm going to have to change those mappings. Because maybe you can see price as a string right here. It can be strange. So maybe you think price could be a number instead. But if I'm trying to do something else with it here, and for now it thinks it's a number, right? With my GraphQL server, it will probably return still a string. So this can lead to differences. Maybe I like to do something like this, to string. So what would happen if you're trying to do toString to an actual string? I don't know, but I can think of some things that could be happening. Or maybe you want to multiply your string by something. So let's suppose I want to add value tags. I don't know what the value tags number in Portugal is, but in the Netherlands it's 21%. So let's suppose maybe I'm doing something like this. So just assume this is a string, or assume it's a number. If you're changing something in your GraphQL server, it's going to lead to strange things on your front end side. So customers are getting confused, you're getting frustrated because you're having bugs in your application. So these are things you don't want to happen. So every time you're actually making a change to your GraphQL schema, you have to update those types in here. So the GraphQL code generator project we saw before, that's something that can help you getting rid of those individual typings. Oh, let me go and Control C this. So I've just stopped the application from running so we can have a look at the GraphQL code generator. And as you might recognize, I've been using the custom configuration setup. So this is my code sandbox API, which is this one. So the URL is the same. I've also defined documents. So in my documents, I've defined all the queries and mutations or subscriptions that I want to send to my GraphQL server. So look at this file. You can see I still have the same query right here, the query get products, which is the exact same query as you can see here. It's almost the exact same. Just make it the exact same to be certain. Yes, that's better. We can format this thing. So it looks nicer already. So in my documents, I've defined the queries that I'm going to be using. So instead of putting your queries inside your component logic, we're going to put queries somewhere else in a GraphQL document file. And Code Generator is going to use those documents, like the one you just saw, to generate a file called graphql.tsx. And let me change a bit to right now first. So let's just assume we're going to generate a TypeScript file based on this schema with my documents, and probably it's going to end up in this generated folder. So I've got source generated, and then I want a new file called GraphQL.ts. And now actually we'll be able to run the graphical code generator CLI, and based on this input, just those like 11 lines, it's going to create TypeScript types automatically from my GraphQL schema. So let me see how to run this thing, because probably I put something in here. So this should be actually a command to run my own configuration with graphical code generator. So for now, I can just do something like npm run generate. Then it's going to start working. You can see it parse my configuration with its YAML file, and it generates the outputs. And the outputs are actually generated right here, right? So this is my GraphQL TypeScript file. We can see the basic color type, so string, boolean, integer, float, and also it generated something based on my product. So this is actually auto-generated for TypeScript with GraphQL. So we have a product, it's a title, which is the basic color type of string, a thumbnail, we have other info in here. We have the relationships with offers, which is an array of offer. So everything that we just talked about and we just saw is in here. So if we would go to this file, you can see here we've created types for some things, right? So we've created a product type. But we don't longer have to define it ourselves, because actually what we've just been doing is created those product type automatically. So whenever you run the CLI command to generate the TypeScript types, you can actually delete this thing, and maybe we can have TypeScript help us find where the product type should be. So yeah, it's generated, right? So cool, we already had to delete some code. Let's look at here, we have no error, so the types are still the same. But we are getting an error right here, because it probably wouldn't recognize something. It's going to think something is a number. Well, it's actually a string. That's stuff we just talked about, right? So probably the offer, it's probably better if we also delete it. And then we can just import it from our generated files. So again, no error, and we will be able to delete a lot of type definitions, right? But we still have some type definitions in here, like actually get products query, and we've defined an output here. So to actually create a strongly typed React Apollo component, we have to change something to our configuration here. So one of the things I just deleted, let's put them back in. So we want the generated file to be a TSX file, because we're going to create TypeScript React Apollo components as well. And our components, they have a JSX format, and as we're using TypeScript, we're going to be having a TSX format. So let's save those files, and let's try and run the generator again, right? So the generator is doing the same thing as it did before. Maybe it takes a bit longer because we're doing a bit more. And yeah, so it parsed the configuration, it generated the output. So let's have a look. So we now have two files actually. We have one with the basic types in there, just in TypeScript, and we have one with the TSX files in there. But they have overlap, because everything that's in here will also be in here and more. So let's just don't be crazy and delete this one, because those color type definitions and the product type definitions, they're also in here. Something else we did right here is creating Apollo React higher order component, creating Apollo React components. And what's the cool thing of this, that it's also using Apollo React already, so we don't have to use it in here anymore. So one thing we can do is get this query component and use it inside our application right here. Okay, so let's try and do this. Let me go find the Apollo component. So get products component props, get product props. Let's see where it is. Get products document. So my document query is also in here. Let me go and find, it's right here. Get products component. It's taking a component prop. So this is all auto-generated. So there's no way to get stressy about it, or to think if someone changes your schema that everything is going to be messed up, because every time you're building your application, you just can rerun the CLI command. So let's try and get this get products component in here. So we can delete this. And now everything's going messy. So let's get the get products component. It's going to auto import. Oh, we don't want to close that right there. Take it. Oh, just want to take this part. We're going to copy it. I'm going to put it here. Let's see if we can format this sample a bit. Yeah. So what we've done here, now we've eliminated actually this type definition. We don't have to import the query anymore. And we also don't have to find our get products query here because it's already in our documents, and our documents are used to generate the get products component. And we actually don't even need the graphical tag anymore. So we've got one error to get down with. Somehow it doesn't know product because blah, 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 blah. This is something we actually don't need because it can already infer from this component that title will be a string, offers will be an offer, ID will have a certain ID. And the same we can do for here because now it's getting kind of messy because it's going to missing certain types. Just get rid of it. And somehow it doesn't know ID. I guess we delete it somewhere. So just delete this one for now. And we can also get rid of those type definitions that we imported. So the only thing we need to import right now is no longer Apollo, no longer create all your types in here. Let me just look at this file just to make it more clear. So you can see in just a few minutes, I deleted tons of code. It's like 22 lines over here, even more. Let's assume I deleted 30 lines of code just by using a CLI that didn't even auto-generate my component, but also make sure that my GraphQL schema is always in sync with the TypeScript type definitions. And then probably the final thing you want to know, is my application still working? So let me try and find out. It's going to be starting the development server. Might take some while. Oh, we're getting errors. What did I do? I didn't save this one. Save it. It still failed to compile. This is strange. Something I didn't even put in there. Try and figure it out. We need to ask for office here. That's why you should never change code last minute. We forward this document. Let me try and run the generator again. Is this the generator? Yeah, it is. Okay. And then try running the server. And refresh this. Yeah, so now it's working again. So the thing that happened, I forgot something in my documents. That's also my schema. So that's something you should actually think about. Whenever you're using this, give IDs to all your fields that you're requesting. And actually the cool thing is, in your generator, you can also define you want to work with hooks. So for now, I didn't put in any hooks just to don't get you confused too much. But if you will look at the website of GraphQL Code Generator, you can actually find they have hook support. They also have support for other libraries than Apollo to help you with data fetching and GraphQL. So it's really cool to have a look at their website and try and figure this out. Go back to my slides. So what this actually does, what we just saw, it opens the door to end-to-end type safety. So in your front-end application, you can now reuse all the types that were generated on your GraphQL schema, on your GraphQL server. And if you're doing the same thing server-side, so if you're auto-generating GraphQL schemas from maybe your database with something called Prisma, or maybe you're using type GraphQL to create type definitions from your schema, those are all things you can do to open the door to end-to-end type safety. Because if you've been working with type systems and you suddenly are working without a type system, you get crazy because you just wouldn't know what to figure out. You wouldn't know why you're having certain bugs. So end-to-end type safety is something you should definitely try and going for. And you can do that by automatically generating React components like we saw. or by using something like this server side. So I can probably see all you thinking right now, should I start converting to TypeScript right away? And like I told you, there are some talks today that talk about how TypeScript helped JavaScript developers or projects with their setup. But something else you'll be knowing, it's really hard to convert JavaScript to TypeScript, especially for large code base. It's going to get real messy. It's going to take you maybe even days to get away with all the type errors. That's something I actually tried. Just try and hang in the TypeScript compiler in any JavaScript project. It's going to implode. It's going to get real nasty. It's going to take you a lot of time to debug. But then in the end, it's going to save you tons of time. If you're working with something, um, if you're working with JavaScript after being using TypeScript for a while, you get confused by why you're getting runtimes errors, why certain arrays won't loop. Um, it takes away a lot of the pain in debugging, and it also takes away um, a lot of the logic testing you will be doing in unit tests. So I can see in projects that I'm using TypeScript in that the amount of unit tests that I had, it decreased a lot because you no longer have to test if a field is actually a string because TypeScript will already know. So those basic, pretty primitive tests actually, there's just something you won't need any longer. So should you convert your JavaScript code base to TypeScript right away? Maybe not. Try to do it in steps because there are certain paths to do it in steps and just generate a component over component. And in the end, you will end up with a fully typed code base. But just make sure that take the time for it because having a type system, it's going to add a lot of, it's going to take away a lot of stress for you, definitely. So, do you want to learn more about me or about the technologies I talked about? Just have a look at my Twitter feed or find me on YouTube. Or to get started with TypeScript, just go to the documentation because something else I always try to tell people: have a look at documentation because documentation it will help you getting clear about what something actually is, what is a library, what's this programming language, how can I go on with it, and definitely, if you are using TypeScript and you're using some sort of front-end framework in JavaScript, go and find Graphical Code Generator because it will help you convert to TypeScript. So thanks a lot. Let's see if we would be having any questions.
Thank you very much, Roy, for the amazing talk. We are a bit over, we are just on time already. So I have one question from Breno. I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly. If GraphQL already have types, why should I use TypeScript?
Yeah. So the thing is, GraphQL has types, but you will only see them after you fetch the data. So if you're getting data from the GraphQL server and you're using your front applications, and it has a you're trying to loop over an array that's actually an object, you will get errors. So if you're using TypeScript, you will be have far more knowledge about what you can do with this data in your application, and you wouldn't have any runtime errors. So you should be using TypeScript to avoid having runtime errors that your user actually see and will get confused about.
And we have a second question also from Breno. Uh, Using TypeScript creates 50% more code. Most of the time, 50% more time. Time is money. So we are going to charge our client for this. This means that in a €1 million project, around 300 to 500 case is just typing.
Yeah, maybe even if you're working as a consultant, maybe you even want to be bugs in there and don't use TypeScript so you can uh, send an invoice for the bugs later on. But in my opinion, TypeScript is going to help you get rid of a lot of bugs, a lot of unit tests that you don't have to write anymore. And if you use something like Code Generator, maybe those $1 million of lines, maybe they get like 500,000, and you can find a way to figure it out with your client.
Thank you. Let's just wait for a couple more seconds to see if we have another question. Okay, so we have a question from Ricardo Simões. Are there any other GraphQL generators like for Angular or VJS?
I'm not sure if they are here yet. I'm not using Angular myself, but I believe Graphical Code Generator can do Angular as well. For Vue, I wouldn't know. I haven't tried Vue that much. But one thing you can do with Code Generator is just create the types, and then probably it would be easier to use them in Vue as well.
Okay, so I think we are out of questions. So thank you very much, Roy, for being with us. Hope you enjoy it as much as we have. See you next time. Thank you all,
Yes,
guys.
thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.